On the 6th of December, 1917, within 20 minutes, an entire city was wiped off the map. 2,000 people were killed in the blink of an eye. 9,000 were injured. 6,000 were left homeless. This was the largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb. But how could two commercial ships destroy an entire city? Why did no one notice the danger? And how did a simple mistake lead to the massacre of thousands of innocent people? This is the story of the Halifax disaster, the day a city vanished from the map. Halifax was a city on Canada's east coast with 50,000 residents. The year 1917 was the height of World War I. This city was North America's closest port to Europe. Before the war, Halifax was a peaceful city. Children played in the cobblestone streets. Men worked in fishing and shipbuilding industries. Women kept house or worked in small shops. But the war changed everything. Halifax's natural harbour, one of the world's finest ports, became the main centre of Allied war operations. This harbour was so large that the biggest warships could anchor there. Every day, dozens of ships sent war equipment from here to Europe. Ammunition, cannons, tanks, food, medicine, everything went to war from this port. Massive shipping convoys that moved with military escort due to fear of German submarines began from here. The port operated 24 hours a day. Workers labored in different shifts. The sound of ship whistles, worker shouts, cranes and trucks was always present at the port. At night, the harbour lights illuminated the sky. The people of Halifax had grown accustomed to living with the constant presence of sailors, soldiers, and foreign workers. French, British, Belgians, and even Russians could be seen in the city streets. Hotels and guest houses were always full. The war had also changed daily life. Many families had sent their loved ones to war. Women worked in ammunition factories. Children learned about patriotism and helping the war effort in schools. Even food and basic materials were rationed. On the 5th of December 1917, the French ship Mont Blanc entered the harbour. From the outside, the ship looked ordinary, but its contents were anything but ordinary. 1,602 tons of monite, explosive mining material used for mineral extraction. 250 tons of pure TNT, the most powerful military explosive of that time. 62 tons of picric acid, 20 times more powerful than ordinary gunpowder. 544 barrels of gasoline on deck, 300 cans of diethyl ether, an extremely flammable substance. In total, 2,925 tons of explosives. This was equivalent to the power of 2.9 kilotons of TNT, nearly 1/6 the power of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Imagine this amount of explosive material in a single ship. Captain Aimé Lemedec, a 4-5-year-old Frenchman with 25 years of seafaring experience, fully knew what deadly cargo he was carrying. Throughout the journey from New York to Halifax, he was constantly worried. Even a small spark could create a catastrophe. He insisted the ship raise the red danger flag and wait in a safe area outside the harbour. But port officials, worried about congestion and ship traffic, said no. He had to enter the harbour and anchor at the designated location. This decision was completely against the safety regulations of that time. Even in wartime conditions, carrying this amount of explosive material in one ship and bringing it near the city was dangerous. But war had priority, and time was short. But Mont Blanc was not alone. The Norwegian ship Imo was also in the harbour. This 5,041-ton ship was empty and was supposed to carry food and medicine to Belgium under German occupation. Captain Haakon From was in a hurry. His journey had been delayed several days. This delay was critical. The people of Belgium were living in catastrophic conditions. The Germans had occupied the country, and widespread famine had emerged. Every day of delay meant more deaths of hungry people. Imo was a large, empty ship that was difficult to manage in confined waters. When a ship is empty, most of it sits above the water surface, and wind has a great effect on it. This makes ship management very difficult in tight spaces. On the morning of the 6th of December, the weather was cold and foggy. The air temperature was about -10 degrees Celsius, and thick fog had limited visibility to less than 500 meters. These weather conditions were very dangerous for navigation in the harbor's confined channel. Mont Blanc wanted to enter the harbor. Imo wanted to exit. The entrance channel was limited. There was only room for one large ship. According to international maritime laws, ships moving in opposite directions must pass each other on the right side. This rule was simple and clear and was observed worldwide. But the problem was that several smaller ships had anchored on the right side of the channel. These ships, which usually came at night, had blocked the standard route. Port officials had no proper system for coordinating ship movements. There was no control tower, no radio, no warning system. Captains had to make decisions themselves and hope they wouldn't make mistakes. At 8 a.m., Mont Blanc entered the channel. At 8:15, Imo began to exit. At 8:30, the two ships faced each other. The distance was decreasing. French pilot Francis Maquis sounded the danger whistle once, twice, 3 times. According to regulations, he was announcing that Imo should correct its course. But Captain From, who was in a hurry, thought he could pass Mont Blanc faster. He decided to go left and maintain his speed. At this moment, both captains made decisions that sealed the city's fate. Captain From, instead of stopping, increased his speed. Captain Lemedec, instead of stopping completely, tried to avoid collision by turning right. None of these decisions were correct, but it was already too late. At exactly 8:45 a.m., Imo's bow struck the front right section of Mont Blanc. The collision itself was not severe. The speed of both ships had decreased, and the impact was relatively mild. But this mild collision set off a chain of events that led to Canada's greatest disaster in history. The collision created sparks that fell directly onto the gasoline barrels on Mont Blanc's deck. The gasoline immediately caught fire and tall flames rose to the sky. Fire spread across the deck with amazing speed. Captain Lemedec knew what would happen. He shouted, "Everyone abandon ship immediately!" The French sailors knew what kind of explosion was coming. Without any hesitation, they jumped into lifeboats and rowed with all their strength to get away from the ship. They screamed, "The ship will explode! Everyone flee!" But their voices were lost in the harbor's commotion. Their language was French, and many couldn't understand them. People thought it was just a simple fire. Mont Blanc, now out of control, moved toward shore. The ship, completely engulfed in flames, drifted toward pier, number 6-inch, the Richmond neighborhood. This neighborhood was the closest residential area to the harbor. An unbelievable scene unfolded. A 3,000-ton ship burning like a giant torch slowly approached the city. Colorful flames from different chemicals rose to the sky. Thick black smoke filled the air. The first to notice were the harbor workers. They screamed and tried to warn others of the danger, but most people thought it was just an ordinary fire. Children abandoned their way to school. They watched the burning ship with curiosity. Families went to windows. The scene was strange and beautiful at the same time. The colorful flames and thick smoke created a dramatic spectacle. Some even left their homes and ran toward the harbor to see up close. Mothers put their children on their shoulders so they could see better. Children screamed with excitement and waved their hands. Halifax firefighters bravely headed toward the ship. Fire Chief Billy Wells ordered the hoses to be prepared. They didn't know what they were dealing with. They thought it was an ordinary fire that needed to be extinguished. Wells and his colleagues went toward the ship with full equipment. They heroically tried to get close to the ship and control the fire. They didn't know they were walking toward death. Mont Blanc moved toward the Richmond neighborhood. This was the closest residential area to the harbor. In Richmond, there was a school with 500 students who were attending classes that morning. Colorful wooden houses stood in narrow streets. Families busy with breakfast. Workers preparing to go to work. Women preparing their children for school. No one knew that in 19 minutes, everything would be over. The fire had now reached the ship's internal storage areas. The internal temperature had reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The explosives were becoming unstable. The phase of picric acid was beginning to change. A few minutes before the explosion, animals near the harbor began behaving strangely. Dogs started barking, horses became restless, even birds began to flee. As if nature sensed what was about to happen, but humans still hadn't noticed. The ship reached shore and stopped beside pier. Number 6. Firefighters were pulling hoses. People had gathered to watch. Children looked with curiosity. Exactly 19 minutes and 35 seconds after the initial collision, the fire reached the first explosive storage. A chain of chemical reactions began that could no longer be stopped. But people still didn't know. At exactly 9:04 and 35 seconds a.m., 2,925 tons of explosives exploded in one moment. Energy equivalent to 2.9 kilotons of TNT was released in a fraction of a second. Describing this explosion is beyond the power of words. A fireball with a diameter of 1.6 kilometers formed and expanded at a speed of 1,000 meters per second. The temperature at the explosion center reached 5,000 degrees Celsius. Hotter than the surface of the Sunday, the explosion's light was so intense it was visible up to 100 kilometers away. People in distant cities thought a second sun had risen. The blast wave spread in all directions at 1,200 kilometers per hour. The speed of sound, air pressure at the explosion center reached 20 times normal pressure. This powerful wave crushed everything in its path. Buildings within an 800-meter radius were completely destroyed. Even strong stone buildings were torn apart like paper. Giant trees were uprooted. Cars were thrown like toys. Within a 1.6-kilometer radius, stone buildings collapsed. Within a 3-kilometer radius, roofs were torn off and walls cracked. Windows broke within a 16-kilometer radius. Even in cities 100 kilometers away, people heard the explosion sound. The ground shook like an earthquake with a magnitude of 5.9 on the Richter scale. This tremor was felt up to 700 kilometers away. Seismographs throughout North America recorded this artificial earthquake. Pieces of the Mont Blanc ship were hurled into space at incredible speeds. These metal fragments acted like cannonballs and created horrific damage. The ship's anchor, weighing 1,140 pounds, was found 3.2 kilometers away. One of the ship's cannons was thrown 5.6 kilometers away and remains there to this day. A piece of ship steel, weighing 1,000 pounds, was thrown 4 kilometers. One of the ship's propellers, which had considerable weight, spun in the sky like a giant boomerang and crashed to the ground kilometers away. The Richmond neighborhood, the closest residential area to the explosion site, was completely erased from the map. A passenger train entering the city was completely derailed. Cars were thrown like toys and passengers were killed or injured. The train engineer, who had noticed the explosion, had tried to brake, but it was already too late. Ships in the harbor sank or were thrown ashore. Even heavy warships were torn from their positions. Imo, which had caused the collision, was thrown ashore and capsized. The city center also suffered serious damage. Commercial buildings, offices, churches, schools. Damage was everywhere. Even the city's central clock stopped working and froze at 9:04. The city library, full of valuable books, was completely destroyed. The city's main hospital was also seriously damaged and had to treat the wounded while needing help itself. The explosion displaced a massive amount of seawater and created a small tsunami, 18 meters high, that reached shore a few minutes after the explosion. This wave carried away what remained of the buildings. Seawater penetrated several blocks deep into the city and carried away people trying to flee. Many who had survived the initial explosion died in this tsunami. 1,953 confirmed deaths, but the actual number was probably higher. 9,000 wounded, many with severe burns, 6,000 homeless, 1/8 of the city's population, 1,630 buildings completely destroyed, 12,000 buildings damaged. News of the disaster immediately reached all of North America by telegraph. The first message sent was simple: terrible explosion in Halifax, urgent help needed. This short message set all of North America in motion. Cities began preparing emergency aid. Doctors, nurses, and medical equipment were gathered from everywhere. The city of Boston, America, sent the first and most effective help. Just 10 hours after the explosion, the special train, Halifax Relief Train, carrying doctors, nurses, medicine, medical equipment, food, clothing, and blankets left for Halifax that same night. This train traveled from Boston to Halifax at extraordinary speed without stopping. Its passengers were volunteers who were willing to risk their lives to help the people of Halifax. The search and rescue work under the rubble lasted for days. Rescuers dug through rubble with hands and shovels. Sometimes a weak voice came from under the rubble, and everyone worked with greater hope. One of the most miraculous rescues was of a 2-year-old child who was pulled alive from under the rubble of his house 4 days after the explosion. He was the sole survivor of his family. There was a severe shortage of medicine, medical equipment, even drinking water and food. Doctors had to perform surgery without anesthesia. Nurses worked 24 hours without rest. There weren't even enough coffins to bury the dead. The city's carpenters worked day and night making coffins. Coffins were brought from neighboring cities. Some of the dead were kept in temporary morgues for several days. The disaster had occurred at the beginning of Canada's cold winter. Thousands of people whose homes had been destroyed were left homeless in severe cold. The air temperature had reached -20 degrees Celsius. The night after the explosion, heavy snow began that made conditions even harder. Strong winds were blowing and had limited visibility. Relief and rescue work almost stopped. Typhus, influenza, and other diseases spread in the shelters. Many who had survived the explosion later died from disease. After the disaster, extensive investigations were conducted to identify the culprits. Several investigation commissions were formed. Witnesses were interrogated. Documents were examined. Initially, Captain Lemedec and pilot Mackey from Mont Blanc were identified as the main accused. They were charged with involuntary manslaughter and negligence. They were even imprisoned for a time. But further investigations showed the matter was more complex. Eyewitnesses confirmed that it was IMO that had violated maritime laws. Captain Fromm and pilot Hayes were also found guilty. Interrogation of port personnel showed that the maritime traffic control system was completely inadequate. There was no proper supervision of ship movements. No safety protocols for transporting dangerous materials were observed. Port officials had no proper system for coordinating ship movements. They didn't even know what cargo Mont Blanc was carrying. There were no special protocols for ships carrying explosives. There were no clear and precise laws for transporting hazardous materials. Ships carrying dangerous cargo were treated without any special precautions. Even warning flags were not mandatory. Investigations also showed that war pressure had played an important role in this disaster. The rush to send war equipment had caused safety regulations to be ignored. French military officials who had decided to transport all those explosives in one ship were also found guilty. This decision was completely against safety regulations. Finally, after months of court proceedings, the main culprit was declared to be the inadequate port traffic control system and the lack of proper safety regulations. The captains and pilots were also found guilty, but did not receive heavy punishments. No one was ever fully punished. The courts lasted for years, and ultimately, responsibility was divided among different parties. This caused anger among the victims' families. Rebuilding Halifax was a difficult and lengthy task. It was estimated that complete reconstruction would take at least 10 years. The reconstruction cost was over $30 million at that time, equivalent to billions of dollars today. The Richmond neighborhood, which had been completely destroyed, had to be built from scratch. Urban planners took this opportunity to build a modern neighborhood with wider streets and more resistant buildings. New houses were built with more resistant materials and better designs. Streets became wider. More parks and green spaces were considered. The water and sewage system was rebuilt from scratch. But the Richmond neighborhood never regained its former population. Many survivors had left the city and never returned.